Welcome to the Speaking Your Lingo podcast, where my goal is to help this generation think well. My name is Shane Lingo, and today I'm excited to have Nick Crook back on the podcast as we continue our previous conversation, but with a little bit of a different focus. And we're going to talk more about what that different focus is in just a moment. But Nick, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Excited for this next episode to continue the conversation. Been keeping up on my New Year's goals and running, and also you've been up to some exciting things. You did a marathon at the very beginning of the year, but it seems like you just did another one.
Yeah. I was able to accomplish that one that we talked about on the first episode we did together. And then at the end of the month, I was able to finish that second one. And so that felt pretty good. And I was going to say, you're looking trim, so I can tell that you have been working out. So how's the plan going?
Yeah, thank you. It's been going great. I was able to complete my first 10K, so that was kind of a big stepping stone in my running journey. And I shot you a text after I finished my 10K because one of the funny things about milestones in running, especially training up to a marathon, is as soon as you hit a big milestone like a 10K, it sinks. Oh my gosh. To get to that next milestone, I have to double what I just did. Like to go from a 10K to a half marathon is doing what you just did a little over twice. And so it was an exciting, a little daunting feeling, but continuing my half marathon training and excited for that next milestone.
Yeah. So from couch to 5K, from 5K to 10K, and then from 10K to half marathon. And then I think you said last time we spoke that you're going to do a marathon, right?
That is the goal. I'm hoping I'll be able to do one end of summer, early fall. We'll see. But I mean, you're my inspiration. You're officially a marathon runner. I mean, I can't keep track of how many marathons you've done now. You're an official marathon runner.
Oh, man. Awesome. Well, after our last conversation, Nick and I thought it would be interesting to wrestle with a similar question as last time we spoke about exercise and physical fitness and how all of that fits into a Christian worldview. And today we wanted to take, again, a little bit of a different spin on it and talk about how should Christians view competition. And one of the things I was thinking through as we were thinking about this question is that competition, it doesn't really just affect like sports, right? When you think about competition, but it can affect many different aspects of life, like the business world. So for those of you who are listening who are in the business world, you know there's competition out there. Or if you do sales, I did a little bit of sales in the past, and that's a highly competitive field. Or when you think about the economy. So like when I get the opportunity to talk about the economy in my government class, right? We think about capitalism and the fact that in a healthy economy, you have lots of competition. You think about just as simple as something like playing a board game with your family, right? And there's competition there. And everyone in my family seems to be super competitive, right? And so we want to win. And so we want to wrestle with this idea is how does this idea of competition fit into a Christian worldview? Now, before we answer some of those kind of deeper, more philosophical questions, I wanted to ask you, Nick, what is the most interesting experience you've had engaging in competition?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, growing up doing competitive martial arts, competition definitely was a big part of my childhood. And so it was always interesting finding that balance, especially in a sport like martial arts that values respect, self-control, honoring your opponent. And at the same time, balancing the emotion of, oh, well, I want to beat this person up and get as many points as I can and just make them lose, right? It seems like there's both of those tensions going on at the same time. And I just remember one of the funniest things competing in martial arts that ever happened. I was probably in elementary school, and I was sparring this other kid. And this kid had his dad right next to him in the ring, and the dad was coaching him, cheering him on, saying, let's go, you got this, come on, get him, like really encouraging him to beat me up. And the dad was bald, and the kid was bald as well. And it looked like they both could have hair, and they were just oddly matching with being bald. And as soon as the judge said, fight, this kid does, I'm going to put quotations around this, a cartwheel kick He pretty much just cartwheeled at me. And to his credit, it was effective. He clonked me right in the head. The dad was like, yeah, let's go. Get him, point, yeah. And he got a point on me. And I was just so confused. I was like, in one moment, I was ready to fight this dude. And the next I'm thinking, what is going on? And then the judge says, go again. And he does the same exact thing, goes and tries to cartwheel. But this time I was smart enough and I just stepped to the side. I punched him and then I got a point. But then the dad over and over was like, yeah, just cheering his son on, even though he was clearly losing. It just kept telling him to do the same thing over and over again. So every time he just cartwheel, I'd step aside, punch him. Cartwheel, step aside, punch him. And it was so bizarre because the dad was trying to be supportive and encouraging, but at the same time, his son was clearly losing. And I remember just feeling so confused about that whole situation because no matter how much the son was losing, everyone was just cheering and hooting and hollering for him. So it was very odd.
It's all about the finesse, huh? And
exactly. And I mean, I guess on one hand, the dad wants to encourage his kid, but even when they're losing, it was bizarre. But what about you? Have you had any interesting experiences when it comes to competition?
Yeah, I was thinking about competition growing up, and I actually went back to one of these wrestling practices I had. And I think this was like my sophomore, junior year of high school. And I can't remember now because it feels like it was so long ago. But one time at this wrestling practice, I was wrestling this kid on my team. His name's Luke, and he was really, really good. Like, he's getting close to his senior year. I think his senior year, he took second in state in California. And he was a couple years older than me. And so we were wrestling at this practice and we were doing live drills, which means and they were live situational drills. So usually start out with some sort of move already in place, and then they blow the whistle and you live wrestle to the end till whatever happens. And we were in this situation where we were, the situation they put us in was leg riding. And I'm not going to go into full detail.
Yeah, like, what's that mean? What is leg riding?
It's essentially like you throw your leg through their leg and you start out wrestling like in that position. Anyways.
Oh, wrestling kids.
And there's this move that I happen to be really good at, and it's called the banana split. And it was like my move at like my entire wrestling career from like high school on. And we got put in this situation where we were starting out leg riding and we had our hands together ready to put someone in a banana split. And this was like my moment. And so I remember they blow the whistle and I throw the banana split and I throw him on his back. And the banana split, by the way, is just like it sounds. Okay. I don't know how to describe this in podcast form for people to understand what this is. Okay. But you essentially throw one leg through their leg and then you wrap your arms around their other leg to where you essentially split their legs in half, and it's called a banana split. And what's interesting about it in wrestling is wrestling's not about submission moves, but it's like as close as you can get to a submission move in wrestling. So they blow the whistle and I throw him in the banana split and I get him onto his back and I hold him there for a second. And then they blow the whistle and the live wrestling's done. And I've never seen Luke so pissed that I had actually, like, I mean, obviously, you know, wrestling at that high level, you don't like losing. And so he was competitive by nature. And the fact that I was a couple years younger and he knew he was a better wrestler than me, it just drove him crazy. And so for me in that moment, like right after I got him in it, you know, it was such a victory. Like, I just did that to Luke. Like, I just got him on his back and put him in a banana split.
Gave him the banana split.
Gave him the banana split, and it was amazing. And then the very next drill, I knew I did something wrong because he just wasted me the rest of the practice. I mean, he just slammed my face in the mat and just demolished me for like the next 45 minutes of practice until I was done. So it was like this small moment of victory and excitement getting to pull off this move, and then just pure defeat. So yeah. And there's probably many other stories I could tell as far as the banana split and how that came into play throughout the rest of my wrestling career, but we'll save that for another time. Anyways, like we talked about before, you and I, we both grew up, we both participated in sports, different sports, you karate, wrestling for me, mountain biking and these things. And so competition has kind of formed a big part of our lives as we kind of think about our childhoods and how we grew up. And as I was thinking about this idea of competition, I thought back to a conversation that I had with one of my professors back again when I was getting my undergrad. It might have been the same professor that I mentioned on the last episode when we were talking about the UFC and all of that. And in one of our conversations, this was in a different conversation, the idea of competition came up. And when he was talking about competition, he started talking about it as if the competition, that competition itself is a product of the fall. And with that, there's not going to be any competition in heaven.
Yeah.
So kind of this idea that competition is inherently, I don't know if I would say sinful, but it's not something that God necessarily intended in the beginning when things were good in the garden. And it's not necessarily something God plans to have in, the resurrected state when he creates a new heaven and a new earth. And so it's interesting to think about competition in that light. And it kind of makes sense because here's where I think he was making his argument. And here's where the tension kind of comes from, is he was trying to reconcile the idea that when you think about Christian virtues, right? You have this idea of serving others and valuing others above yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And then you try to reconcile that idea of like serving others and putting them ahead of you and the focus not being you, and it's about kind of their success and being for them. And then you reconcile that idea with this idea of competition, which is to do better than others and to get ahead of others and to win.
Yeah.
So I kind of wanted to throw that out to you and to kind of think about that for a sec. And some of the verses that lead to the other side, if we think about values, is like Philippians 2:3-4. It says, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others." And then you have passages like Mark 9:35, which says, "And he sat down and called the 12, and he said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all." And so do you kind of see where that tension would lie about, you want to serve others and put them first, and then this idea that when it comes to competition, it's really about pushing ourselves to win and to beat the other person. And so what do you think about that? Is competition, first of all, I kind of want to go back to that original question. Is competition a part of the fall? And then how do we reconcile these two things?
That's a great question. And coming back to the idea of the fall, was there competition before the fall? I think when we look at competition from a virtue standpoint, we can obviously see the clear examples of where competition violates something like Philippians 2 or Jesus' message to his apostles. We can clearly see where there's examples of competition leading to dishonoring others, cheating to get ahead, showing off, really trying to put yourself on a pedestal, literally, compared to anyone else, right? We see those clear undersides of competition. However, it could be a big statement to say altogether that competition is morally bad or is inherently a bad virtue, because we could just as clearly point to examples where competition might actually be a good and effective thing, where it does teach people sportsmanship, how to work on a team, how to actually maybe value someone else on your team in the context of team sports. But baked into those positive aspects of competition is being used as a means to grow someone's character or grow someone's virtue, grow someone's ability. And so kind of rewinding the tape back to the fall, before sin entered the world, humans were in perfect communion with God. And so I wouldn't think there would be competition before the fall, because would we need to use the means of competition to grow in character or to grow in teamwork, to grow in our capacity to be more virtuous when you are in the full presence of God? And so from that fall question, I would argue there probably isn't competition before the fall or in heaven. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that competition in itself on a fallen world is always bad. But as we balance those tensions, something that I think is important to mention is sometimes as we have, conversations about Christian virtues, especially in a Western context, sometimes we can Christianize Western virtues. We can kind of combine and try to use Jesus to justify things that people in the West would deem important. And even at the top of the show, we talked about the idea of how competition is a part of our economy, is a part of capitalism. And so it would be easy for us to want to say, well, competition can be a virtually good thing. But would that be us trying to put Western virtues on an equal pedestal to the Christian virtues, which would be humility, valuing someone above yourself? And so that's where I feel like there really is a delicate balance between, in a fallen world, competition can be effective in growing character, in growing your skills, right? Even in physical competitions, and the importance of taking care of our body, as we talked about the last episode. However, you can see pretty clearly how it does contradict the message of Christ. And so should we let Christian virtue be more important and uphold it more than the Western virtue of competition? But what do you think about that? Would you say, as Westerners, we consider competition a virtue?
Yeah, I think that's interesting on a couple fronts. I think I actually see it a little bit different than that. And I tend to think of competition as something that actually was originally good. Now, it's hard because I don't think we necessarily have any examples of that biblically to look to, but this is just my assumption at this point. And I'll speak to a couple reasons why in just a moment, but I think it's something that was originally good that was tainted by the fall. And if you think about it, there are many things in the world that were created as good that we as humans can kind of twist because of our sinful nature and because of sin, and we turn them into something that they weren't meant to be. So for example, you think about sex, you think about food, you think about work, right? All of those things we know are inherently good. They're good things, and biblically speaking. And the Bible points to them in a good light. And yet, all of those things can be twisted, distorted, used as bad things that are corrupt. But all of those things are good things in themselves. And so the question that I kind of am asking, and kind of where I place competition, is in that category. And so that's kind of how I view competition. I see it as something that is actually good, that's been tainted by sin. And so in its best, most healthy form, it's ultimately good. Now, again, I think that's a lot there. Like, I think there's some things to back up that claim, because there's obviously negative things that can come with competition, things like envy and selfishness and bitterness. But those things aren't necessarily inherent to competition itself, right? So if we're going to talk about competition, if we want to call it a virtue, a Western virtue, Christian virtue, we at the very least have to separate it from those things, from the broken parts of it, the envy, the selfishness, the bitterness. Just like if we were to take all of those other categories, like food, for example, and we have to separate it from gluttony, right? And look at it in its most pure form and what it was created to be, if, again, competition falls within that category. But even so, even if we were to look at it that way, and either view that you take, there's still this tension, because oftentimes winning means someone else has to lose. And I recognize that. Like, winning means someone else is going to lose. And to bring it back to kind of my high school wrestling days, I was thinking about this again. My junior year, there was a senior in my same weight class, and the way that wrestling works is you have wrestle offs, and whoever wins, like usually it's like 2 out of 3 wrestle offs or whatever for the year, they get that position. And so I was thinking back to that as I was reflecting on this, and there was a kid who was a senior and he was in my weight class and he was pretty good, but I was just a notch better than him. And when it came down to the final wrestle off, I beat the kid and I got the position. I got the varsity spot. And I was thinking about that tension because, you know, for that kid, that was devastating. And for me, I got this position and now I was able to be on the varsity team, and he didn't get to wrestle in that spot his senior year. And so I guess I bring up that scenario because this is this real life scenario where it's not, because some people in this conversation would be like, well, if it's a team sport, it's all about like the team and you're helping your team win. And in wrestling, you do help your team win. You have these different competitions, but there's just certain scenarios where you can't like make it the ideal. And I think the scenario I just painted is kind of this realistic scenario. I win, I get the varsity spot. This kid who loses, he doesn't get the varsity spot and he doesn't get to wrestle varsity his senior year. So yeah, I mean, kind of brings up more of the competition, but what do you think about that?
Yeah. And I love that example because, you know, the way I would interpret that scenario is, you know, competition can be a positive thing in a fallen world because it gives you the opportunity to learn how to lose well or how to still honor someone that does get ahead of you, right? It's easy to feel devastated, destroyed, envious, but competition in that context in a fallen world where not everyone can be a winner, where some people do come out on top, then it makes sense that competition would be a good to help them develop that skill to handle the tough realities of life. And going back to this idea of competition being an inherent good, I think I struggle with that because I can see its positives in a fallen world, but for something to be deemed in itself a good, it should meet a function. For example, when it comes to sex or food or relationships, right? Those are all things that were inherently good, and the fall tainted them because they now stray from their original function. You know, where food in the garden was to sustain us and give us health is now in a fallen world used to be gluttonous and to, you know, be an escape for our emotions. But when it comes to competition being a good in itself, I would argue it requires a proper function. And so what would that proper function of competition be, either before the fall or in a fallen world? Because I could totally see how in that scenario, the proper function of competition could be to help that person, you know, reconcile that loss, right? Or to help that person who won still be humble even in the winning. You know?
Yeah. You can see the benefit within the context of a world that's already fallen, but what could the context be before that? And I guess the best answer I can give, just thinking about it, would maybe be that by allowing us to compete with others, we can become better versions of ourselves. That it actually causes us as human beings to have to rely on other human beings for growth. And I think growth, going back to the Bible, has always actually been a part of the human experience. Like going back to Adam and Eve in the garden and some of those experiences. I don't know if just because they were walking in the garden with God and there was a sense of perfection that limited growth, like our growth in growing in knowledge and growing in learning and growing in understanding. And I think competition aids that in a way that I don't think many things do. So that's just kind of my first response to that, is there are good benefits, as we're going to talk about and see, that are inherently, I think, good in themselves when it comes to competition. When the motivation is, I guess, becoming the best version of you is kind of a way to say that. And I feel like that sounds kind of modern and
a little humanist. But
and some of those things, but I think there's a reality there, even if we're using that type of language, like becoming the best version of you, whatever you in a biblical context or in a Christian context, we have an idea of what we think that is, right? But I think competition at the very minimal or in a simple way helps us to grow. And I could see that being a function from the beginning of humankind till now, right? And really, let's just say it this way. The people who don't like competition are the people who always lose.
That's the most Shane quote I've ever heard.
Okay, I'm only kidding. All right, let's bring this back though. So the next question that I was thinking about that connects to this idea, and we need to bring some Bible into this, obviously. Obviously, sure. I do.
For sure.
Does the Bible have anything good to say about competition in your mind then, as we're wrestling with this, and about the benefits?
Yeah.
So what do you think? Like, are there any like biblical passage that you've looked into or that you've looked at that you would say actually do bring a positive light to competition? Yeah, I'm going to stop there. And then I have another argument I think I want to bring up, but let's start there. Like, what do you think about that? Does the Bible have anything good to say? Like, does it ever put it in a positive light?
Yeah. And this is where, we can approach the Bible in different ways as we navigate our views of the world or our views of the Christian life. And we would both be able to see there aren't times specifically in the Bible that preach directly to this conversation of competition. However, that doesn't necessarily mean the Bible's quiet on it. It just means we have to take a more systematic approach to forming beliefs about competition, which is a fancy way of saying pulling different scenarios together throughout Scripture to come up with a coherent view that still honors all the Scripture involved. And just, thinking off the top of my head, when it comes to competition, Esther, one of the more famous stories of the Bible, she became queen by winning a beauty contest. That was a competition of sorts. The king's wife didn't want to be paraded in front of everyone. He threw a competition. Poor Jewish woman enters into the competition, wins, becomes queen, and through that competition is able to save the Jewish people from being killed. And so that might be an indirect example of where we see a tangible benefit from competition.
Yeah, I think that's a good example, but it doesn't give us the answer as to whether the competition in itself was good.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
No,
because
that's a great question.
It's not even Esther who's the one, and Esther wasn't, perfect herself, and we're trying to read kind of a description, right? But it was the king who came up with this idea, and he's by no means, I think, celebrated as a moral being who we should strive to be like, right? I mean,
100%. Yeah, not everything that happens in the Bible has God's seal of approval. And what I mean by that is we read of people doing terrible things in the Bible, and that is not God, affirming that situation, but recognizing the reality that God was working in a fallen world. And so that's maybe where I would point to, competition can serve a purpose in a fallen world. That was a time where a competition was redeemed to do something greater.
Yeah.
But as far as other examples in Scripture, you have the passage from 2 Timothy 2:5, an athlete is not crowned unless he competes according to the rules, talking about broader themes of sanctification and pursuing God.
But that is interesting if you think about that passage, because that does connect kind of the spiritual life, and it uses this idea of competition to help you understand it.
Yeah.
And it kind of reminds me of the passage I think you brought up last time we spoke, which was in 1 Corinthians 9. Do you remember speaking about that, where it talks about
1 Corinthians 9:24?
Yeah, do you have it right there?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Yeah.
And the version that I think that I have often read talks about the idea, run in such a way that you may win. And so it's interesting to think about, because it uses this idea of competition, and it kind of goes into that idea, and he's trying to again relate this idea of competition to the spiritual life. And so I don't know if that doesn't fully answer our question as far as the tension with it, but it definitely, within the context of the world we live in, I think we could at the very least argue that competition serves good within a fallen world, right?
Yeah, and I think competition can be used as something very relatable because in one way or another, everyone is engaged in competition to an extent. And I think it was a super relevant illustration for Paul to use, but to kind of push back on the more, Philippians 2 approach to competition, even the competition that we see Paul referring to, doesn't look anything like the race he's encouraging us to run. Because, in the passage he says, but only one receives the prize. But in Christ, all can receive the prize, right? We can all run and engage in the spiritual life, but there isn't one winner as if a race was. And so I think that's part of the motivation that Paul's bringing up is, hey, live like you are the one to be accepted by Jesus or loved by Jesus. Live as if you are running towards a relationship with God forever, as if there could only be one. However, we still recognize anyone who follows after Christ, who accepts him, receives the prize, meaning a relationship with him. And so I think that might be a way to use competition as a way to encourage, but not necessarily endorsing the competition itself as, the race we run in following Christ is different than any other race someone might compete for to be number one.
Yeah. I can see what you're saying there. It's kind of interesting to think about. And I mean, overall, the Bible doesn't seem to say much about competition, right? I mean, it has some of these passages we can pick out. We can look at these stories from the Old Testament. We can look at some of these stories, or some of these analogies from the New Testament. But one of the things that I was kind of thinking about that, and this kind of goes back on my argument probably a little bit, this will set me back a bit in my argument, but is competition connected to the idea of war? And I know that's kind of an interesting, it might feel a little bit like a rabbit trail, but like when you think about the idea of war is not something that I think God intended, right? And yet God uses war throughout the Old Testament to establish his people and to accomplish his judgment on the earth and some of those things, right? And war is connected to competition. There's a sense of competition in war. Like the goal is obviously to win. And the difference between all these things is the motivation behind them and why we do them and all those things. And yet in a fallen world, war wouldn't be a part of that context, but in a fallen world, God has used it and even commanded it and endorsed it. And you could argue that the same thing could be true of competition. So you could put it maybe in the same realm.
And on that vein of war, another thing that's interesting about that is on situations or battles in which God commands or which God delivers his people through, that is all for his glory, for his honor, so that the people would know that he is the Lord, that he is the one God. And the times in which the kings or different judges or rulers of Israel would pick wars unapproved by God or wars that they wanted to fight, it almost always led to disaster. And so even within that context of war, it's a way of God showing that he is on top. Right, the competition aspect of war to show he is actually number one. He is God over all. And when humans try to take that aspect of war and say, okay, I want to show my strength, then things went south for some of our biblical leaders.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a great point. Now, another question that I wanted to ask that I think is important when it comes to this conversation is, how would you define healthy competition? So, I mean, first of all, in this conversation, I assume that you would say there are healthy forms of competition in the world that we live in. I think there's healthy forms of competition in the world we live in. But how do we define that? What is healthy competition?
Yeah, that's a great question because, again, I believe that there are clear examples of unhealthy competition. I think there's examples of healthy. And I would argue, competition can be considered amoral. It could go either way. But to focus in on those positive aspects of competition, I think that there does need to be some parameters in place of a competition in order for it to actually produce the kind of productive character growth or productive self-growth. And I think one of, the main parameters, which can almost be hard to define at times, is fairness. Right? I think competitions have to be fair. There needs to be established rules. Here is what is allowed. Here is what's not allowed. I think these rules need to be established, right? There's so much. Refs are some of the most hated people in competitions. Why? Because they're convinced, they're bending the rules for this team. They aren't applying the rules equally. And I think rules actually provide common ground for a competition to take place. And where this one might be harder to define, I think a type of comparable ability, meaning obviously some people are going to be more successful than others. However, we don't put the 30-year-old man racing against, 12-year-old children, right? Even if the rules are the same, there still needs to be a type of comparable ability so that it isn't just a complete blowout or someone isn't just completely competing in a way that just puts everyone at a disadvantage and they have no way of actually competing against that person.
Yeah, I think you bring up an interesting point. So there has to be some sense of fairness, some sense of, like, you wouldn't throw to give your example, you wouldn't throw a 12-year-old, kid in a boxing ring with a full-grown adult.
Exactly.
And just, get blown away. But there has to be some sense of fairness to it. When I was thinking about this week, I was kind of wrestling with this idea, and I was thinking about the topic and healthy competition and some of these things. I actually started thinking about Fred Rogers. Now, do you know who Fred Rogers is?
The Mr. Rogers?
The Mr. Rogers, the man from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And did you ever watch that, like, growing up? Did you watch Mr. Rogers?
Honestly, I remember him. I remember watching it. I don't really remember lots of episodes. I was a little on the young side. Hey, I'm still a 90s kid. I was born in the 90s, but a little on the young side.
This will tell us, were you Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood or Daniel Tiger? Which are you closer to?
I'll plead the fifth.
But anyways, kind of an interesting connection. But at the school I teach at, we get to do something kind of fun during the winter where we teach these classes during a term that we call Winterim. And we get to teach these kind of different classes throughout the year than we would normally teach. And one of the classes that I get to teach is called Mr. Rogers in a Brief History of Public Television in America. And one of the things that I was noticing as I was thinking about our talk is that he actually had quite a bit to say about this idea of competition. And I don't know if you know this, but he was actually a Christian, and that was one of the motivations behind the show that he did. He was a Presbyterian minister, and I think overall just a brilliant man. And if you go back and study him and watch his show, you can see that in how he interacted with children and what his goals were. But back in 1981, he did a whole series on competition. And during my Winterim classes, I actually show a few of those episodes based off of competition. And one of my favorite Mr. Rogers episode of all time is part of that series where he brings in a professional football player named Lynn Swann. And the best part about Lynn Swann is he happens to play as a wide receiver for the best football team in NFL history. And you know who that is, right? I mean, you know what team that is.
Oh, I won't say it out loud.
The Pittsburgh Steelers, right? And so he played for the Pittsburgh Steelers during the Terry Bradshaw era. And anyways, he does this whole episode speaking about how children should view competition. And again, it's not just like one episode that he did, but he did this whole series. And so Fred Rogers had thought a lot about these kind of different aspects of competition that we're talking about today. And he once gave this commencement speech at Dartmouth College back in 2002, where he tells a story of this Special Olympics race in which he speaks to this idea. And I wanted to play a clip for us because I feel like it'll cause us to kind of view this and to think about this maybe in a different light, or at the very least, I think it's going to add some to this conversation. So let's listen to this clip and then we'll take some time to talk about it.
Have you heard my favorite story that came from the Seattle Special Olympics? Well, for the 100-yard dash, there were 9 contestants, all of them so-called physically or mentally disabled. All 9 of them assembled at the starting line, and at the sound of the gun, they took off. But not long afterward, one little boy stumbled and fell and hurt his knee and began to cry. The other 8 children heard him crying. They slowed down, turned around, and ran back to him. Every one of them ran back to him. One little girl with Down syndrome bent down and kissed the boy and said, "This'll make it better." And the little boy got up, and he and the rest of the runners linked their arms together and joyfully walked to the finish line. They all finished the race at the same time. And when they did, everyone in that stadium stood up and clapped and whistled and cheered for a long, long time. People who were there are still telling the story with great delight. And you know why. Because deep down, we know that what matters in this life is more than winning for ourselves. What really matters is helping others win too, even if it means slowing down and changing our course now and then.
Wow. No, that is an incredibly powerful story. I don't think I've heard that one before.
Yeah, the first time I heard it, I was like, I guess I just didn't really know where to place it, because it really is such a beautiful story. And just thinking about, I don't know what that does to competition, because I wouldn't expect that every time is the thing, like that response every time.
Yeah. I mean, even as I'm just responding to it, I feel a tension between my heart and my head. You know, my heart saying, wow, that's so beautiful. Like, obviously, compassion, kindness should always triumph competition. Even if you're to say competition's a virtue, you know, hearing that story makes you want to say, you know, love and kindness, it is an even greater virtue. But my head is telling me, well, imagine if, you know, Patrick Mahomes wanted to be loving to the 49ers this Super Bowl.
I wish he would have.
Yeah, exactly. It like threw a pick 6 just cause, you know, like intellectually, if you did choose mercy, charity in these competition moments every time, well, that'd be the best way to find yourself not in competitions. No one would want you on their team.
Totally. But the story's pointless if it's not in the context of competition at the same time.
Yeah.
Like if there weren't people coming together ready to win this race with this same goal in mind, the story kind of falls apart. But I kind of want to go back to one of the things that he says in the clip that I think helps narrow this in and gives us kind of a healthy view of competition. He says, deep down, we know that what matters in life is more than winning for ourselves. What really matters is helping others win too, even if it means slowing down and changing our course now and then. And what I like about that statement is a few things. He puts competition, it feels like, in its proper place amongst the most important things in life. We know that winning isn't the most important thing, especially winning for ourselves. And sometimes that means slowing down and changing our course now and then. But it's almost like there's this recognition. It doesn't mean slowing down and changing our course all the time, or in every instance, or in every context. And so I think just like with any other scenario that we talk about when we get into this kind of messy gray area, if you want to call it that, it takes wisdom, right? Not everything is appropriate or good for every single situation. And so it seems like competition, for us to fully understand and to use it for the good aspects that we know are there that come with it, like learning hard work and building others up and building ourselves up, we have to know how to appropriately weigh it in every context, in every situation. And most competitions, like healthy competition, there are usually two people signing up who want healthy competition against them. Like, I don't know about you, when I'm at my healthiest and I'm in some sort of competition, I want the person across from me to be at their best and to perform their healthiest in competition when I'm healthy. If I just want to win, then I don't care. But in my healthiest form, it's like, I want them to be at their best, but I want to beat them at my best. You know what I mean? But they want the same thing. They want me in that moment to love them well. I have to do my best. You know what I mean? When they have a healthy view of competition. And I think all of us who have been in, sports at a serious level, we get that. Like, we want the other team to be at their best, and we want to be at our best, and we want to compete against them. And it actually honors them to do our best in those situations to push them further.
Yeah, even a fun example with my wife and I, whenever we play a board game together and she wins, the first question she asks is, "Did you let me win?" Because it doesn't feel like it's actually a real win unless I gave it my all. And for the listeners, hopefully, we'll see if my wife makes it this far in the episode. Whenever she wins, she totally always wins fair and square, but I always have to tell her I let her win.
Oh my gosh. Either way, I'm going to show her that part.
Yeah, just that clip.
I'm clipping that out.
Just that clip. No, but that brings up a good point. In a proper context of competition, you want someone competing at their best because you don't want to feel like you were just handed something, because that defeats the purpose of competition. If someone just hands it to you, then you aren't really competing. And so I could see how, in a context, the most loving thing to do would be to compete at your best, to give them, a real scenario of competition.
Yeah. Yeah. And kind of off that same line of thought, this is kind of another argument that I would kind of pose for why competition is good. Now, again, I'm not going back to that original, like, was it good from the beginning, but it definitely has good uses in our world today. And one of those reasons is because I think competition helps us to grow in ways and to push ourselves in ways, again, that we can't do if we don't have competition. Does that make sense? Because we can't push ourselves as individuals as far as we can go. In other words, I would say we often sell ourselves short from what we can actually do. And when we compete with others, though, it pushes us further than we can actually go by ourselves. And here's an example that I was thinking about for this, is that people used to think that running below a 4-minute mile would be impossible. Like they thought, just can't be done. Like people have tried and tried and tried. And people were chasing this goal for years and years and years, but no success. But then this man named Roger Bannister comes along, and he breaks the 4-minute mile barrier with a time of 3 minutes and 59 seconds. Wow. Actually, 3 minutes, 59 and 4/10 of a second.
Wow.
So this was back in May 6th of 1954. Okay. I can't even imagine what it would be like to run a mile that fast, right? Yeah. Insane. Okay. Now, the interesting part is that once Bannister broke the record, all of his competitors saw that it could be done. And just 46 days later, after this has been tried years and years, 46 days after this man breaks the record, a man named John Landy, an Australian runner, not only broke the 4-minute mile barrier, but with a time of 3 minutes and 58 seconds.
Wow.
And then just a little while after that, 3 runners broke the 4-minute barrier in a single race. And then you fast forward to today, and you have thousands of people that have broken the 4-minute mile barrier. And my point in that is it goes to show what all of those people needed was to see one person do it. And then you see person after person. And I think as we look at sports over time, you see that same thing. You see these things that people think that's just impossible. Like no one's ever done it. No one can do it. And then one person does it who's competing, and it shows people that it's possible, it can be done. And then you see other people pass it. Not only that, but those people that were, I think about the 3 who ran it together, it was probably running it together with someone pacing and then pushing each other that they were able to run that fast of a mile. I know for me, when I was running in high school, the fastest mile that I ever ran was because I had a good buddy of mine who I wrestled with, and we were racing around the track, and we were both racing each other, going as fast as we could go. And we both got our fastest mile ever, right? But that was through competition. And it's something I don't think I would have ever been able to, a time I would ever be able to accomplish without that competition. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? That's kind of a...
Yeah, no, I mean, I think kind of that response really made me think of a few things in general. Part of healthy competition is, 2 people wanting to compete and 2 people wanting to compete at their best. And that really does allow us to be pushed and challenged and to grow from someone else. Because, if you and your buddy who ran that mile, if just one of you were like, oh, well, I'll just run at his pace. If you guys both kind of secretly had that mindset, that you wouldn't have been pushing each other. So maybe part of healthy competition isn't just a fairness, comparable abilities, but also everyone involved really aiming to do their best. And as we're talking about, competition in this positive light, I thought back to one of your jokes earlier on, that some of the people who hate competition the most are the losers, or people who just don't compete. And I think, part of what I'm seeing among Gen Z or millennials kind of in meme culture, these videos kind of pop up on my feed every once in a while of, not even wanting to engage in competition, because then you actually have to put your full skills on display. Like I saw this reel of this person who, being told you're super smart your whole life, and now not wanting to do any more education because you don't want to be actually exposed as not very smart. And I think sometimes we hold back from engaging in things that really challenge us, engaging in things that really put our abilities on the spot, like competition, because competition in a way is an incredibly vulnerable thing. To do your best, put it all out there, and still lose is saying, I wasn't good enough. And I think that fear is stopping so many people from wanting to engage in competition, instead of viewing it in its more positive light, that really sometimes the only way you can actually grow is to put all yourself out there, fail, but then, see someone else succeed, and now you want to do better. And I think we probably do need to embrace some of those more positive aspects of competition in our day, and especially in these current and upcoming generations. I think we got to start ditching participation trophies and really start encouraging our kids, to really put themselves out there and to overcome that fear of failure.
Yeah. And I love that point, because there is so much good that comes from competition in that realm of creating humility in us, learning how to lose gracefully, learning how to root for others when we do lose. I mean, I feel like we could almost do a whole episode just talking about the positive aspects of competition, even though we kind of frame this with some of those challenging tensions in those questions. We absolutely, or at least I absolutely, and I think you do too, see the great things that actually come from competition. And with that, it kind of brings up the question I was thinking, are you going to have your kids compete in sports?
Yeah, my wife and I talk about this a lot because, we have our baby girl, our daughter, and when my wife and I first started talking about putting our kids in sports, I asked her, what sports do you want them to play? And she said, oh, well, they're just going to decide. And I'm like, what? no, we're going to put them in what sport we want. Like I think parents have more influence than they might think. There is an appropriate time where you let them decide. But no, I definitely do want to expose Sophie to some sports, put her in some different environments. I think team sports do have a good place, but also I'm tempted to just want her to be a swimmer so I can just go to swim meets indoors, not be outside in the cold in Utah or in the extreme heat in Utah. But yeah, I definitely want to expose our daughter to sports and kind of try to be wise about it. Like, what are sports that have either healthier cultures or that aren't too taxing on their growth or bodies? I think sometimes you can put your kids in too many sports. I have a student in one of my ministries who it seems like every other week he's injured. He's only in middle school. But yeah, I definitely believe in putting her in those environments, teaching her some of those helpful lessons that sports can provide younger kids.
Now, with that, are there any sports you hope she doesn't do? Are there any sports you're like, I just sure hope she doesn't gravitate towards that?
Yeah, honestly, my wife and I, we both talk about this. We're like, we hope that she just doesn't want to become a dancer. This might be an odd story. Okay, wait. I'm going to tell the story. You can decide if it's inappropriate. My wife and I, we went to kind of a dance showcase, and she was supporting one of her students that she knew through serving in church. And some of the performances were great. They were cool and all. And then there was this middle school dance group that came out, and they were just shaking their booties. They were being provocative. And it was just, I felt like I should not be here. Just so uncomfortable watching this. And so we kind of hope she doesn't gravitate towards dance, if you could call that a sport, cheerleading, things like that. We're hoping she might gravitate more towards something like cross country, as I've become a runner, something, her and I could do together. Maybe something like swimming, a little bit more safer of a sport, or something along those lines.
Yeah. I mean, with the dancing thing, like, to give dancers credit, if you have, I'm sure, like a good dance team and somewhat a coach with like good insight, I'm sure there's like, you could have something that's a little bit more classical, and
that is true,
like ballet or something like that, or something that's more about the art and less about the I think you said booty shaking.
The art of booty shaking.
The art of booty shaking, as it's called. So but I get that fear and I get that tension, especially as a dad of girls as well. And I was thinking about our girls, and I was thinking I've never been someone who's been like super into soccer myself, but our girls started playing soccer, and this was the past year or so. And I had this experience that made me understand all of the years of watching parents who overreact on the sideline.
Oh, great.
Because I was that dad. I was the extra coach yelling and screaming and cheering and, hollering. And the guy who's never really played soccer at all in his life, who's an expert,
yeah,
right?
The
expert, telling his girls what to do. And but the best part about the experience was that I'd never experienced anything like this. Was both of my girls at one point during the season scored a goal. And in the moment when each of my girls scored a goal during the game, I was so proud in that moment. I don't know if I've ever been more proud, in the sense that, like, proud of myself. Like, when I look back at my wins and my victories in anything that I've done in life, for whatever reason, watching them score and them win, I was way more proud. Like, it was the proudest moment ever. And it kind of allowed me to feel and to sense why parents get so far into their kids' sports.
Yeah.
And it's not even something I feel like I can completely describe. It was just this moment. And anyone who has kids who have played sports and have watched them win and overcome challenges, right? Because for them, that was each of their like first goal. And I know they were both working towards that. And I don't know, I was just like so proud in that moment. And it was awesome. So yeah.
And I think, tying back to the Mr. Rogers clip, I think that's a great example of sometimes where it is more exciting to see someone else win or to help someone else win because, as much as it is, your girls as individuals growing, there still is the parents that are taking them to practice that I'm sure are helping them with the drills and whatnot. And I think, family sports or just sports for little kids are a way for the family to really feel connected and almost as a unit, because not only is it her win, but it also is a reflection on what you've done to be able to prepare her and help her win.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Now, I feel like I already know your answer to this question based off of our conversation, but is there going to be competition in heaven? And is Jesus right now preparing to waste us in a foot race?
He might, only if it's on water, then he might be preparing that. I don't know. I just got to say, how can there be competition when Christ has already won? Amen.
Oh my gosh. All right. Well, what, I don't know where to go from there, to be honest, but if you were to help sum up everything that we have said for our listeners today about this idea of competition, how can we sum this up for them?
Yeah, I think summing it up, the nature of competition, you and I maybe have some slight disagreements on if competition itself is an inherent good before the fall, but I think we can both agree competition is a reality in the fallen world. Whether it's in our context, through economics, whether it's in sports, competition is a real reality. And I think it can have big downsides. It can definitely violate clear Christian virtues of humility and love as represented through Christ and written about in Philippians 2. Yet at the same time, competition can be a really important way for individuals to grow in character, for individuals to experience self-growth. In competition, healthy competition, defined by clear rules, clear boundaries, comparable skill, and as well as willing participants, people who are really trying to engage in this competition, because no competition is fun when another team is secretly trying to cheat or another team is really just kind of canning it. And we can uphold competition as a valuable thing in the world. And I think the retreat. Is
it a good?
It is. I wouldn't say it's an inherent good, but I believe it can be functionally good. And as far as our current generations, our next generations, I mean that's the whole point of the show, helping the next generation think well. I think we do
helping this generation.
Oh, this generation,
well. But this generation includes the next generation.
That's right. That's right. I do think we need to be doing more to embrace competition, pushing ourselves to do new things, to compete at our best, and really helping model for younger generations what it looks like to win and to lose well. So you can cheer loud when your daughters get a goal, but don't get kicked out the sidelines from the refs. We got to model it well.
It might happen. It might happen. Well, love it. Great way to sum it up. And as we get ready to wrap things up today, first of all, I just want to say thanks for listening. Nick, thanks again for being on the show. This has been another fun one, and can't wait to have you back on the Speaking Your Lingo podcast. Again, if you haven't shared this with your friends and family, or if you haven't checked out the Speaking Your Lingo website, go ahead, check it out, leave us a review. Other than that, we want to say thanks for listening, and we'll see you on